Hello. So, as I said earlier, we've already dealt with the operations. Now we are going to the next topic, which is what? Casting or typecasting. Now, typecasting is simply converting one data type into the other. Okay, it's just as simple as that. So, let us see how we can convert strings into integers, into floats, into lists, or lists into strings, or integers into floats, or into strings, and back and forth within them. So, going straight forward to typecasting. Now we have in the course of the lesson, I've introduced you to five basic data types. That's strings, integers, floats, boolean, and lists. But we've not talked much about lists. But the last class we spent most of the time talking about strings. And you can check our other videos on strings and string methods and string operations and string concatenations and stuff like that. So now we want to see how to convert one data from strings to integers, from integers to floats, from floats to strings, from integers to boolean, from lists to strings, and what have you. So our first attempt is to convert any data type, like is to convert a data type into what? A string. Okay, str. So for strings, all data types can be converted to what? A string, str. All data types. And to do that, use the str function. Okay. So let's say I have a data. Let me call it data. And this data is 23, which is perfectly what? An integer. But when I say maybe new underscore data is equal to str, that's a string, the representation of a string. Then I put in the data, the function called str, which converts anything you put in here into a string. Now, I want to print, first I want to print this data, and secondly, I want to also print this new data. Okay, so let's see if there's going to be a difference. Okay, now when I print the data, I see 23, 23. Okay, so this first data is an integer. Okay, the new data is now a string, but I see them the same way. So I'm telling you, don't use your output as a way of predicting the data type. They all look the same when you print them out. 23 as an integer and 23 as a string looks the same at the output section. So you need the type function to determine the type of data you are dealing with. So let me come here and say, instead of printing out the data, I'm printing out the type of what? The data. So I'm saying find the type of this data, and print it out for me. Okay, so it won't print the data, it will rather print the type for me. So let me also print the type for this one too, for new data. Okay, so this will print the type of data and this will print the type for new data. And when I run this, you realize that the type of data it belongs to the class called integers. So this one is an integer, and after it has been passed through the str function, now it has been converted to what? A string. So in some sense, it has a quotation mark on them. So in some sense, it looks like something like this. 23. Yes, this is the new data it looks like. But before then it was something like this, 23. Okay, so this 23, which is an integer, has been converted to 23 with quotes on them. Okay, so from str to for all data types. So let us look at other data types like um let us look at something like, let me remove these ones, and other data types like floats. So 12.56. Okay, now when I run this float, the first one, it says the data type here is float, but then after passing it through the string, now the new data type, the type of the new data type is what? A string. Okay, so this 12.56 has a quotation mark on it, which is in quotes 12.56, then the quotation closes. So, and you can pass in a list of items. So it could be apple, and it could be 12 then it could be Kwesi. Okay, wait, let me give it a quote. Okay, so it could be this list. Now when I run it, the first data, the type of it is a list, but once it passes through the string function, it becomes what? A string. And now when you pass it through the string function, what actually happens to this list is that it now gets a quotation mark around it. So you can put in quotes, so you can put shift in quotes, then control V. So now the list, I'm coming, let me put single quotes to avoid some confusion with the computer. Okay, so we have our data type. So now the whole list has been enclosed in a quotation mark, and it now makes the whole list now a string kind of data. Okay, so you can pass any data into a string. Okay, so that being said, let me move on. And it holds true for boolean, and let me change this one to boolean data type. Let's say true. Okay, so once I run this is a bool, but now it's what? A string. Okay, it was a bool initially, and now it's a string. Okay, so let's move on to converting strings. You can only convert some strings and boolean into an integer. Okay, now if you have, let's say, let me still use maybe data is equal to, you have a string, say 23, in the form of a string, and you want to convert it to a number or an integer, say new data. Okay, so the new data will be equal to the int function, then you put in the data. Okay, so when you print out the type for new data, let me comment this one out, and let me comment this one out so that it doesn't confuse us. Okay, so we have data to be a string form of 23, and we've converted it to what? An integer, and we print it out, and let's see. So now the type of the new data is what? An integer, but here it's what? A string. So you can convert strings into integers using the int function. But then if this string that has digits in them, if it has something like 0.9, meaning it has a float inside of it, it won't work. It will give you an error because you cannot convert floats into integers, because the computer wouldn't know what to do with the 0.9. Okay, you are converting a decimal number into a whole number. The computer wouldn't know what to do with the what? 0.9. Should it round it up to 24, which is not 23? And should it round it down to 23, which is not equal to 23.9? Okay, so the computer will be confused as to how to run this. So remember that when the string has a float in it, you can't convert it into an integer. You can only convert it into an integer if it has what? An integer data in it. But as we discussed earlier, for strings, you can convert any data type into a string. But for integers, you can only convert strings that have digits in them into integers. Okay, now similarly we can look at boolean. So let's say you have true, the word true as a boolean. You can also convert it what? Into an integer. Okay, so let us print out the data type. Let us print the new data, comma, and the data type. Okay, so the computer should print the new data for us and the data type. So sep is equal to that. So I want them to print it on a new line. That's why I included this command. I'll show you more about it in our later videos. Okay, so the computer should separate these two values by the next line, by going to the next line. Okay, so Now we have true, right? And we are saying we should convert true into an integer. Okay, we should convert the word true into an integer, and that is going to give us what? The new data type. So the computer should print the new data type and go to the next line and print the type of the new data. Okay, so when we run this, we see that now after converting the true into an integer, by printing it, we get 1. Okay, and when we check the data type, it is now what? An integer. So true will be converted to 1, but false will be converted to what? 0. Okay, false will be converted to 0, and it is still an integer. Okay, so true will be converted to 1, false will be converted to a 0. But then you can't convert a float into an integer. So 5.8, you can't convert this into an integer. You get an error. Wait a minute. 5.9, is it an improvement or what? Okay, so wow. So 34.895, it seems you can convert them to the integers, but then you end up losing all the digits behind it. It's quite similar to floor division. I don't know if it's an update, but you can now convert them to integers. But if they are in a string format like this, you can't convert float strings into an integer. Okay, that one you get an error. But if it's a normal float, you can still convert them into an integer. So let us add here float can be converted to integers, and we see how it works. Okay, but then you lose all the decimal points. Okay, so the next thing we also talk about is but then you cannot convert a list into an integer. Okay, let's say you have 1, 2, 3, even though there are numbers in there, but there is no number that looks like this structure. Okay, there is no number that looks like this. So when you try converting to a number, it would it will give you an error. Okay, it will give you an error. So do not use lists. So lists cannot be converted, but strings, certain kind of strings, and boolean and floats can be converted to what? Integers. Now let us go on to the next data type. So for floats, you can convert ints, strings, bool, all of them to floats. Okay, so when you have a number like this 12, and you say you have a number like 12, and you say new underscore number, the new number is equal to the float version of what? 12, and we know 12 is an FOAT float of the number. So convert this 12, which is an integer, into what? A float value, and let us print it out. For floats, you can see the okay, new number. Okay, so from here, let me comment this one out. Okay, so from here, we can run this code. New data line 13. There's still an error in line 13. Ouch. So let us put something. Okay. Okay, so focusing here. Now this 12, which is an integer, has been converted to a float by putting what? A 0.0. Okay. So integers can be converted to floats. Okay. And normal floats can be converted to what? Integers. Okay. But then take a look at this 12, which is a string, like a string-like integer. When you convert it to float, it works. But here, when we're dealing with integers, okay, when we're dealing with integers, you can't convert 12.2, which is a float-like integer, which is a float-like string. This is like a float string combined. You can't convert it to what? An integer. It won't work. Okay, it's giving me an error at line 13, and at line 13, it's saying that this one won't work. Okay, so anytime you get a string and the string contains a float inside, you can't convert it to an integer, but you can convert it to what? A float. But if you have a string and the string contains an integer inside, you can convert it to an integer and you can convert it to a float. So when you have a string, it can be converted to, when you have a string of, let's say, any number, when you use the float function, it can convert whether it's an integer or float. But when you have a string of any number and use the integer function, it will convert it to an integer only if the number is an integer in the string. But if the number is a float inside a string, it can convert it to an integer. Okay, so take note, because it's very important when you start using the input function, you are getting numbers in a string format, and you are now thinking about which format to use, which kind of casting function to use, then it becomes a problem. So this is the float. So you can still float this, but you cannot float an apple. Okay, apples are not decimal value, so you still get it wrong. Okay, so let us stick to our other data type. So now let us look at boolean, which is true. Let's say true. So true can be converted to float. Wow. Oh, I think that the problem is here. Let me. Okay. So true can be converted to floats. Okay. So the true is a float, is converted to float, which is, for when we converted true into an integer, we got 1. But since you are using float, it has to bring the point 0. So floats are numbers with a decimal point. Okay. Then true, this is true. Let's look at false. Okay. Let's look at false, which is 0.0. Okay, so false converted to a float is simply 0, but 0.0 because it's a float. Okay, that's why 0.0 is a float and 0 is an integer. 1 is an integer, 1.0 is a float. But in terms of value, they are both equal. Okay, so let us look at how to convert other data types into Boolean. Now for Boolean, you can convert all data types into what? Boolean. Okay, into bool. And let me comment this one out. And for example, let's say we have a data like maybe num is equal to 12. Now if I'm to convert this, let me use a variable name as x. Just saying, if I'm to convert this into, so let's say print bool into brackets x. Okay, so when I run this code, I get true. So when you convert 12 into a boolean, you get true. Now somebody will ask, why is it true? Now for Boolean, it's simple. Anytime you're converting any data type into a Boolean, it's checking if there's a data. Okay, so if you're converting integers into Boolean, any number is true except 0. So if this number was a 0, then I run play, it's false. But any other number, including the negative sign, is still true. Okay, so negative 1000, yes, negative 100,000 is still what? True. Positive 100,000 is still what? True. But 0 is false. It's false. So for Boolean, for integers, any number is true, but 0 is false. And with it holds true for other data types. Now for strings, when you put in apple, it is true because it contains a string. But once you make it empty, now this is a string with no character or an empty string, it's false. So for converting any data type into a Boolean, it simply means you are converting, once it is empty or there's no data inside that data type, it's false. But if there is a data in that data type, it's true. It's a simple logic and it applies to a list. So with this list being empty, when I run it, I'm still going to get false. But once you put in something, let's say 12, it becomes true. Okay, and it doesn't matter how the number of items you put in there, it is still true. Okay, so we can convert all data types into boolean. Okay, and somebody will ask, so what if you put true? Yes, true is already a boolean and it will give you the same thing. Okay, now let us look at converting data types into a list. Okay, for list you can convert strings. Okay, strings, yes, I think you can convert only strings into lists. Let us try it out. Okay, so let us say we have a data called y, and for y we have a string, maybe hippopotamus, and with that, with a string hippopotamus, you can say print the list form of y. So it should convert a string y into a list. What the computer does is, oops, I'm seeing list this. So let me put asterisk here and let me see. Sorry, I'm using square brackets. Oh, sorry. No, yes. So you don't use square brackets. It's the square bracket means that you are putting the y inside a list, and that's what happened here. But by converting to a list, you use the curl brackets, the normal brackets, you know. So now when you are converting a string into a list, it splits the string into individual characters. So every single character becomes a string of its own, all in one list. Okay, going all the way till the end. Now, if you had a space, maybe hippopotamus is a big animal. Okay, when we run this, what we are going to get is hippopotamus is a big animal. Now, take a note. You see this empty space. After the S, there is an empty space. So this empty space, to us in English, we always feel like it's nothing over there. It's just an empty space. But to the computer, it means something. So it's also being converted. So everywhere, every single character in there, including the spaces, full stop, whatever it is, if I'm to put a full stop back here, and we are to run the code again, and I go to the last end, the full stop alone is also another separate character on its own. So the computer will convert every single character, full stop, question mark, words, numbers, whatever it is, into the list form. Okay, it breaks it down into the list form. Okay, so but then if you have a float 67, you will get an error. Okay, you can't convert 67 into a list. Okay, it is not iterable, and you can't convert 9.78 into a list. No, and you can't convert a boolean like true into a list. It also gives, so you can convert only what strings, but you can have a string of any other data type like 4.56. So we have a string, but it's in the form of a float. Then we run it like this, and we see 4.56, which has been converted to what? A list. So you can convert only strings into list. You can convert all data types into boolean. You can convert integers, strings, and boolean into floats. And you can convert strings, boolean, and floats into integers. But take note, with the conversion of strings into integers, the string has to be an integer. There should be an integer in it. If there's a float inside a string, it would give you an error. So somebody may ask, why are we learning this? So reason for learning typecasting. Okay, so let's say we ask a user for the age. Okay, then we say input maybe your age. Okay, let's say input your age. But then after inputting the age, you want to print out age times 4. We want to print out whatever age the person inputs. We multiply by 4. Let me comment this one out here. So we multiply by 4 and display it on the screen. So once I run it, your age, so let's say 21 years old, and I press enter, well, it didn't do the normal multiplication, it repeated it. And I think I've mentioned string operations already. Because the age is a string, as you can see, the age is a string, so we repeated a string 4 times. Okay, if I'm to put division sign here, we are going to get an error because you can't divide. Let me put 18, press enter, an error. You can't divide a number and what, a string. So it says unsupported operand, like operation type. So we have string and an integer. So it happens to be that the age is what, a string, and this is the integer. Okay, and we can't do this operation. So before we can do this operation, we have to convert the age into what, an integer. Okay, now that I've converted the age into an integer, now I can do my operation. So let's say 18. So we get what, the 18 has been converted into an integer, and we divide it by what, 4. So 18 divided by 4 is what, 4.5. Okay, so that's how the integer function comes in handy. So remember this, always the input function gives you a data in the string format. Okay, so always, anytime somebody makes an input into your program, it comes as what, a string. Okay, it always comes as a string, str. So if you're expecting the user to make an integer, to input an integer, when the user inputs the integer, it comes as a string, then you convert it into the integer you want. Now, if you are expecting the person to input an integer and you run the code and the person inputs a float, let's say I am 17.5 years old, that's 17 6 months. Now you see that the 17.5 is a float like character in a string, and I told you that integers cannot convert strings with floats. Okay, so we have to use the float function. Okay, so we have to use the float function. So when you run it and the person puts something like 18.9 and press enter, it works. Now the 18.9 has been converted to a float, and now the division has been performed. Okay, but then somebody will ask, so if the person inputs an integer, will it work? Yes, it will work. So if the person inputs, let's say just 18, it still works. So for floats, it can convert strings that look like integers and floats to floats. But for integer, it can convert strings that look like floats, but can convert only strings that look like integers into integer. Okay, so you take note. So sometimes, or most of the time, people prefer to use floats. But then in a case of age, you don't want your person to use a float. You are not interested in the points, like the number of months you spent on this earth. So how old are you is always an integer. How many apples are on the table? It's always an integer. So you may want to use the integer because you're expecting your user to input an integer. But remember, your code will fail if your user inputs an integer or like a float kind of value, or even the person inputs, yes, a float kind of value, it will fail. But remember, the only float that can be converted to integers is when it's having a point zero. Let's say 18.0. Oh, even this one doesn't even work. So 18.0 can't even be converted to what? An integer. Okay, I was assuming it can, but then it can't. So it can't even if the person brings a whole number or an integer and the person adds a point zero, your code is also going to fail. So this leads us into the next lesson, which has to deal with 16. I'm 16 years old, which has to do with um exception handling. So sometimes you don't know what your user is going to enter into the data. Okay, it's going to be any kind of data, but how do you handle it if you are not getting the right data from the user? So I'll end this video here. And in our next lesson, we'll be going into type exception handling. Okay, so bye.